God versus Nature, the conflict between religion and science in history. Chapter 6. Europe's discovery of Aristotle leads to the Renaissance. As we saw in Chapter 3, in the early Middle Ages, the dominant philosophy was that of Augustine, and thus Plato. According to this philosophy, there are two worlds, the heavenly realm above and this low physical world below. We are pulled down by this world in the flesh. We are, quote, deformed and squalid, unquote, and, quote, tainted with ulcers and sores, unquote. Our only significant source of ideas and values is faith and the supernatural. Accordingly, during this period, people directed all their intellectual activity towards the other world. They performed virtually no science of note. From the 6th century through the beginning of the 12th century, the only books of Aristotle known to the Latin West were his books of logic, the Organon, minus the Posterior Analytics, his work on scientific demonstration. But this was about to change. The Reconquista leads to a translation movement from Arabic into Latin. As recounted in the last chapter, Muslim armies conquered the bulk of the Iberian Peninsula early in the 8th century. The Umayyad dynasty ruled Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, from 756 to the early 1000s. The Umayyads were succeeded by the Muslim Berber dynasties, the Almoravids and the Almohads. The Umayyads built and supported an extensive library in Cordoba and patronized intellectuals such as court physicians and astronomers, competing with the Abbasids' center in Baghdad to attract the best thinkers. Starting in the 10th century, Christian forces exerted a prolonged effort involving numerous wars to regain control over the peninsula. Historians now call this multi-century effort the Reconquista, meaning reconquest. Christian forces had taken Toledo and Lisbon by 1100, and Cordoba and Seville by the first half of the 13th century. In 1492, the last of the Muslim kingdoms in Iberia was defeated, bringing the entire Iberian Peninsula under the Christian rule of Ferdinand and Isabella. The conquering Christians discovered a culture that, to their credit, they recognized as more advanced than their own. This new culture was familiar with many valuable books unknown to the West, so they began to translate these books into Latin. Gerbert of Aurillac, circa 945 to 1003, who would be elected as Pope Sylvester II in 999, was one of the first Europeans to recognize the value of the translated Arabic texts. When he was Archbishop of Reims, he lectured on the logical writings of Aristotle and others. His main intellectual interest was the classical mathematical quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and musical theory. A number of Arabic astronomical and mathematical texts made their way to Catalonia in Christian-controlled northern Spain, and into the hands of Gerbert when he was visiting the area. When Gerbert returned, he wrote about the ideas he had learned, including the Arabic numerals, and his writings generated extra interest in the translations. This translation movement lasted through the 12th century and into the 13th century, and, as a result, beginning in the 1150s, Latin editions of Aristotle, translated from Arabic, started becoming widely available in libraries. Suspicious that the works of Aristotle and others had been corrupted in the process of multiple translations, Europeans then began looking for texts in the original Greek, which could often still be found among scholars from Constantinople, who had preserved many Greek works. Eventually, translations were made directly from Greek into Latin. The flow of Greek manuscripts from Constantinople ended after the city fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Aristotle's ideas, in one form or another, became almost ubiquitous in European intellectual life. One sign of this is the fact that competing Christian factions even cited Aristotle in their arguments against each other. A case in point was the story of the Cathars. This anti-Catholic dualistic sect, based in southern France, achieved a high level of popularity in 12th century Europe. Cathar intellectuals explicitly relied on Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction to point out the problem of evil. A good and omnipotent God cannot be reconciled with the obvious existence of evil in the world. The Cathars argued that there must have been two creations, not just one. The good God created the world of the spirit, while at the same time, an evil God, equal in power, created the material world. Opposing the Cathar view, churchmen, such as the Dominicans, argued that Cathars were actually in fundamental conflict with Aristotle's view, that there is only one universe and that it is not evil. The Cathar threat to Catholicism was not ultimately removed by arguments, but by force. Pope Innocent III's call for a crusade against the heretics in 1208 led to their brutal and bloody extermination. After the Crusaders stormed the city of Béziers, the papal representative proudly declared that, quote, nearly 20,000 of the citizens were put to death, regardless of age and sex, unquote. Aristotle's this worldly philosophy is fully rediscovered. The full discovery of Aristotle's writings was a shock to the medieval mind. The Aristotelian stance, with its unabashed admiration for the material world, its distaste for mystical explanations of natural phenomena, and its optimism about human nature, ran counter to centuries of otherworldly ascetic Christian values and practices. To the medieval Europeans who had been surrounded by ignorance and otherworldliness, the extent of Aristotle's interest in and knowledge of the physical world was impressive and overwhelming. But many in the church disliked Aristotle for his almost anti-Christian philosophy. In addition to his overall this-worldly orientation, Aristotle had explicitly argued for several ideas that clearly contradicted Christian doctrine. The world has always existed. It is eternal. There is no personal immortality. When a person dies, his personal soul ceases to exist. Pride is not a sin. To the contrary, it is the crown of the virtues. The interest in Aristotle developed primarily in universities. The universities had originated in cities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford during the 12th century. They consisted of a single faculty of arts, which provided an undergraduate curriculum, and graduate programs in theology, medicine, and law. The church had official control over the universities, but it rarely exercised tight control. Most university students had no plans to enter the church. The universities provided a basic education in classic Greek and Roman texts, an education they became universal throughout Europe. The intellectual center of Europe was the University of Paris, and during the 13th century it was home to a major conflict about Aristotle's role in the curriculum. In 1210, the Parisian Synod, a council of bishops, issued a decree that, quote, No lectures are to be held in Paris either publicly or privately using Aristotle's books on natural philosophy or the commentaries, and we forbid all this under pain of excommunication." Unquote. In 1215, this ban was renewed. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued another renewal of the ban, specifying that Aristotle's books on natural philosophy were not to be used until they had been, quote, "examined and purged of all suspected error," unquote. But these bans were not effective, and by the 1240s, a number of teachers were lecturing on Aristotle's works. In spite of Pope Gregory's ban, no one ever apparently created a purged version of Aristotle. During the time of these bans, Aristotle's works were openly studied at other universities, such as Oxford. In spite of the bans, interest in Aristotle continued unabated, and in 1255, Aristotle's writings on natural philosophy became required reading for all Faculty of Arts students at the University of Paris. By the second half of the 13th century, Aristotle's works on metaphysics, cosmology, physics, meteorology, psychology, and natural history became compulsory objects of study. No student emerged from a university education without a thorough grounding in Aristotelian natural philosophy. Why did Aristotle's philosophy become so popular? Ever since the Church Fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Ambrose of Milan, Christian culture had a legacy of at least partial respect for pagan Greek philosophy. And in spite of the challenges it posed, Aristotle's philosophy offered a distinct value, as Richard Rubinstein relates in his book, Aristotle's Children. Quote, "The Aristotelian corpus, troubling though it might be, represented the most comprehensive, accurate, well-integrated, and satisfying account of the natural world that medieval readers had ever encountered. Here one could discover a method of rational inquiry and the ways of spotting illogical, sophistical arguments. Here, nature's mysterious secrets were disclosed. How fish sleep. Why a thrown object continues in motion after it leaves the hand. How the Milky Way was formed. From such particulars, the reader could ascend with the philosopher to breathtaking generalities, such as the types of possible knowledge and classifications of the sciences, the dynamics of natural change, and the nature of being itself. Part of the work's appeal lay in its encyclopedic scope. Long known in Europe as a master of formal logic, Aristotle was now revealed as the master of all knowledge, whose ideas would henceforth become the starting point for almost all discussions of natural or social phenomena." Unquote. Two key figures who helped ensure Aristotle's continuing influence were the Dominican friars Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, and his student Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas creates a protected area for reason. Born to a wealthy Bavarian family, Albert of Lauingen studied the liberal arts at Padua, in Italy, joined the Dominican order, and was ordained a priest. He went to the University of Paris circa 1241, and this is where he first discovered the recently translated writings of Aristotle. Albert wrote extensive paraphrases of almost all of Aristotle's works, and he soon got a reputation as a master of all knowledge. From an early age, Albert was interested in the natural world, and his discovery of Aristotle further validated this interest and encouraged him to give it full expression. Given the time in which he lived, the scope of Albert's investigations is truly impressive. He studied falling objects, rainbows, stars, and the moon. He did experiments on the effects of sunlight in generating heat. He did alchemical experiments and isolated the element arsenic. He studied fossils as well as minerals and their properties. He did extensive comparative studies of the structures and parts of plants, making numerous original discoveries. He performed studies of animals, especially their reproduction and embryology. He did studies of insect mating. All of this interest in the natural world led to the reasonable accusation that he was neglecting theology. While teaching at the University of Paris, Albert encountered a brilliant student who shared his love of Aristotle, and who would go on to eclipse Aristotle's philosophic achievements. Thomas Aquinas, circa 1224 to 1274, was a brilliant Dominican friar. Originally from the Roman Campania, he studied at the University of Naples, the first university founded independently of the Church. Here, Aquinas learned about and studied Aristotle's natural philosophy, using Arabic translations and Islamic commentaries, which at this time was banned at most other universities. He later went to the University of Paris, where he studied under Albert, and he then traveled with Albert to Cologne to help with establishing a school. Aquinas' masterwork, Summa Theologica, presents his extensive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. The most important aspect of his thought was his view of the status of reason. Quote, Thomas startled his contemporaries and initially earned the reputation of being a dangerous radical by extending the realm of reason deep into the territory of theology. According to him, there are only three doctrines that cannot be proved by using natural reason: the creation of the universe from nothing, God's nature as a Trinity, and Jesus Christ's role in man's salvation. These truths, which cannot be deduced from experience, depend on faith alone. But other theological doctrines, even the existence of God, as well as the Creator's immateriality, perfection, goodness, knowledge, and other attributes, can be arrived at by using one's reason to analyze and generalize from observed data. Unquote. Whereas Augustine had seen faith as the base of reason, and Tertullian had seen faith as contradictory to reason, Aquinas saw faith as merely a supplement to reason. When it came to the nature of reason and the physical world, Aquinas accepted Aristotle's views. Reason is an autonomous faculty which we must use and obey. The physical world is knowable and real. Life is about living, not cursing our existence. Both Albert and Aquinas made a formal and explicit distinction between revealed theology and natural philosophy, between the truths of faith and the truths of natural reason. Revealed theology started with faith in authorities and used logic to develop further knowledge. Natural philosophy started with observation and logic and used only reason to come to conclusions. Albert and Aquinas held that both types of knowledge were valid. Aquinas held that there was an overlap between these two domains of knowledge. This overlap consisted of truths of theology that could be established entirely by natural reason, without any use of faith. Such truths included the existence of God and his basic attributes, such as omnipotence and omniscience. Aquinas presented 5 famous proofs for the existence of God, arguing from observational evidence. The use of reason to establish such truths of theology Aquinas called natural theology. Truths of faith, on the other hand, included such items as the Trinity, the virgin birth, the transubstantiation of the Eucharist, and the Assumption of Mary. This distinction is evident in an oath imposed on the masters of the Faculty of Arts. Quote, "The Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris, beginning in 1272, required all masters to swear an oath that they would not introduce theological matters into their disputations. In sum, the disciplines of theology and natural philosophy have nothing to do with one another and should be kept apart." Unquote. The worldly philosophy of Aristotle is evident in many aspects of Thomistic thought, though always modified to fit into a Christian context. Aquinas held that the goal of life is happiness, and that in order to achieve complete happiness, one needs to achieve divine grace. But he also held that we are natural creatures, and that in this life on earth, we can achieve a certain degree of happiness. In this world, reason is efficacious, and we should use our reason. For Aquinas, of the two paths to truth, faith and reason, reason is more important for guiding our actions in this world, although he held that they can never conflict. Another issue that reveals the influence of Aristotle on Aquinas is the nature of the soul. Augustine, in true Platonic fashion, had viewed the soul as being trapped in the body as in a prison. Aristotle wrote that the soul is the form of the body, and that it ceases to exist after the death of the body. This was not consistent with Christianity, and Thomas held that after death, the soul exists in an unnatural state, and it only returns to a natural state at the final resurrection. The innovations of Aquinas in expanding the scope of reason were unprecedented for a Christian thinker. But even Aquinas' expanded scope of reason was outdone by the radical Aristotelians, led by an outspoken teacher at the University of Paris named Seiler de Brabant. Seiler presented Aristotle's ideas about nature and human nature without even attempting to reconcile them with Christian doctrine, in effect leading to two independent realms of truth, truths of reason and truths of theology. Seiler argued that, from the point of view of reason, the universe is eternal, since all effects have causes which are the effects of prior causes. But, from the point of view of theology, the universe was created at a certain point in time. Seiler also claimed that reason leads to the eternity of mankind and the rejection of personal immortality. But when pressed, he acknowledged that when faith leads to different conclusions than reason, then faith is the only source of truth. In spite of this concession, Seiler and his associates were plagued by accusations of heresy, and Seiler himself was eventually murdered. In 1277, an official condemnation listed 219 different propositions, all of which were expressly prohibited not only in the classroom but also in private discussion. This list included numerous ideas advocated by Seiler. The radical Aristotelians were effectively silenced. The Thomists, on the other hand, were not silenced at all. In the half-century after the death of Aquinas in 1274, his influence continued to increase. In 1278, the Dominican order of friars officially adopted the theology of Thomism. In 1323, the Church canonized Aquinas as St. Thomas. The Thomist synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelianism became a dominant force in the Church for centuries. Aquinas brought Aristotle's ideas into the mainstream of Christian thought and boxed-in theology, isolating it as a separate academic discipline. Given the previously dominant handmaiden view of science, this amounted to the liberation of reason and interest in this world. Aristotle is a continuing force in the universities. From the end of the 13th century on, the universities hosted a steady sequence of Aristotelian teachers, and this continued until the 17th century. The study of Aristotle and other classical Greeks led to the emergence of a new type of scholar who was primarily focused on the nature of human beings as natural creatures living in this world. These scholars were the humanists. Humanism first developed in Italy, with figures such as Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man of 1486 has been called the Manifesto of the Renaissance. Key humanists also included Marsilio Ficino, Leonardo Bruni, Niccolo Machiavelli, Desiderius Erasmus, and Michel de Montaigne. Although they had an implicit Aristotelian influence, the humanists had eclectic philosophical interests. Many were attracted to Platonism, but others were drawn to Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, or skepticism. The full recovery of Plato's writings in the 15th century led to an increased interest in Plato. But overall, Aristotle was much more widely read than Plato during the Renaissance. From the 1450s to around 1600, as many as 4,000 editions of the works of Aristotle may have been published, compared to fewer than 500 comparable editions of the works of Plato. A wide variety of publications presented Aristotle's ideas, including textbooks, summarizing tables, introductions, and commentaries. Leaders of the Protestant Reformation, such as Martin Luther, urged a return to the roots of Christianity in the Platonic theology of Augustine and other church fathers. So these leaders tended to reject Aristotle. Luther referred to Aristotle as a, quote, damnable, arrogant, pagan rascal, unquote, who has, quote, seduced and fooled so many of the best Christians. Quote, this defunct pagan has attained supremacy, impeded and almost suppressed the scriptures of the living God. When I think of this lamentable state of affairs, I cannot avoid believing that the evil one introduced the study of Aristotle. His book on ethics is worse than any other book, being the direct opposite of God's grace and the Christian virtues. Yet is it accounted among the best of his works. Oh, away with such books from any Christian hands. Unquote. Many who shared this hatred of Aristotle attempted to remove Aristotle's works from Protestant universities, but these attempts were ineffectual. There was too much demand for Aristotle, even among Protestants. The academic interest in Aristotle often did not follow the spirit of Aristotle's philosophy. There were Aristotelians like Cesare Cremonini, who considered Aristotle's writings to be the ultimate standard of truth in natural philosophy, ranking higher than any actual first-hand study of the natural world. Cremonini was infamous for his refusal to look through Galileo's telescope. But, crucially, some Aristotelian teachers did have respect for the actual spirit of Aristotle's philosophy. One of the most prominent Aristotelians of the 16th century was Jacopo Zabarella, who taught at the University of Padua shortly before Galileo studied there. Zabarella's treatises on logic, methodology, and natural philosophy were popular throughout Europe. Quote, Zabarella strongly emphasized observation of the external world as a source of knowledge, while stressing that reason, not Aristotle, is the ultimate foundation of valid knowledge. Such a position is clearly spelled out in the lecture introducing his course for the academic year 1585. Quote, I will never be satisfied with Aristotle's authority alone to establish something, but I will always rely upon reason. Such a thing is truly both natural and philosophical for us, and I will also seem to imitate Aristotle in using reason, for, in fact, he seems never to have put forward a position without utilizing reason. Unquote. The Renaissance as a rebirth of reason and interest in this world. Aquinas' liberation of reason led to the Renaissance. After centuries of obsession with the next world, the Renaissance was a rebirth of interest in this world, the world of nature, in living, breathing human beings. This can be seen vividly in the humanism and the art of the period. The Renaissance artists learned how to carefully examine the physical world around them. Their artwork showed a new level of realism and detail, and the figures in their paintings came to life in all three dimensions. Historian Lisa Jardine gave her History of the Renaissance the very appropriate title, Worldly Goods. The Renaissance artists painted realistic landscapes and portraits, and competed with each other to paint the most vivid textures, colors, and shadows. They resumed the classical interest in nude figures in both painting and sculpture. The ancient Greeks had developed techniques for creating the illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface. These included foreshortening, aerial perspective, and a type of linear perspective. Aerial perspective is the technique typically used in landscapes whereby objects in the distance are shown as paler, less detailed, and bluer than nearby objects. Foreshortening is the technique whereby objects not parallel to the picture frame are reduced. These techniques can be seen in surviving Roman murals at Pompeii. Artists abandoned the use of perspective during the Middle Ages because of its otherworldliness. During the Renaissance, these techniques were rediscovered. In the late 13th century, artists such as Cimabue, Duccio, and Giotto began to use foreshortening and a non-systematic form of linear perspective. Early in the 15th century, Brunelleschi developed a systematic technique of linear perspective, which Alberti described in his treatise Della Pittura. After this, almost all Italian painters studied perspective. These techniques gave the Renaissance artists new power and freedom, allowing them to depict a far greater range of subjects realistically. Renaissance artists also worked on developing new techniques for different painting materials. They often experimented with new materials and new ways of using materials, such as new ways of painting effectively on walls. They embraced a spirit of progress and self-improvement. It is likely that men such as Ghiberti and Brunelleschi saw themselves not just as artists but also as scientists, adding by progressive experiments to the sum total of human knowledge. Many of the great paintings of the time were demonstrations of what could be done and how to do it. Patrons knew this and encouraged it. Each time they commissioned a master, they were striving to help him push forward the frontier of knowledge and skill a little further, or in some cases a lot further. It was the true spirit of the Renaissance. This spirit was in full expression in the work of Leonardo da Vinci, in his observational drawings of anatomy in nature, his controlled experiments in water flow, his medical dissections, and his systematic studies of movement and aerodynamics. Although Leonardo's scientific writings were lost and did not influence the science of the following centuries, his scientific interests are a clear sign of the continuity between the new observational outlook and the development of science. The new realism of the Renaissance extended even to literature, which became more concerned with the real lives of real human beings. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was written using a unique literary framework, a Canterbury pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Historian Paul Johnson notes, quote, "The vivid directness with which Chaucer brings out character, both in describing his pilgrims and within the tales they tell. It is the literary equivalent to the formulation of the laws of perspective and foreshortening by the artists of Florence. These men and women jump out from the pages and live on in the memory." Unquote. Another outgrowth of Renaissance naturalism was the natural magic tradition, in which people looked for occult or hidden connections in nature, links not perceptually obvious or visible. Examples of such connections included the attraction of iron to magnets, the ability of sunflowers to follow the sun across the sky during the day, the moon's effect on the tides, and the effect of medicines. These connections were often thought of as sympathies or antipathies, in effect anthropomorphizing natural phenomena. In order to find these connections, people often looked for distinctive signs that God had placed on things. For example, the fact that a walnut looks like a brain was considered evidence that it might be medicine for the brain. Many believed that grasping these hidden connections could be of great practical value, but they did not yet have a valid method for discovering or understanding them. Another sign of the worldliness of the Renaissance is the emergence of educated men who bridged the gap between scholarly writing and practical trades. The self-educated French potter Bernard Palissy contributed to chemistry, geology, forestry, and agriculture. The humanist professor Jurg Agricola authored De Re Metallica, a systematic treatise on mining and metallurgy that became the standard work on the subject for the following century. Both Agricola and Palissy would become inspirational figures for Francis Bacon. While not a scientist himself, Bacon would write much on scientific method that would be influential during the scientific revolution. He was also impressed by the usefulness of inventions such as the compass and the printing press, and by the Renaissance natural magic tradition, insofar as it was focused on developing practical knowledge of nature. The central invention of the Renaissance was Gutenberg's printing press, which actually required 3 different inventions: the movable type, the ink, and the press. The first printed works that Gutenberg officially produced were published in the 1450s. Printers used the new press to print broadsides, pamphlets, and many different types of books. Soon, printing presses were being built throughout Europe, and they were kept busy. By 1500, more than 25,000 different books had been published in Germany alone. Gutenberg's development of the printing press in the 1450s made possible the inexpensive reproduction of texts, greatly facilitating the rapid dissemination of knowledge. Several other factors also contributed to the culture in which the scientific revolution would occur. The 16th century Reformation had splintered the church into numerous warring camps, ending the monolithic hegemony with which the church had dominated the European intellectual scene. Starting in the 15th century and extending through the 16th, a series of voyages of discovery aimed at finding new trade routes yielded an explosion of information about exotic places. The sea voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator, Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, Columbus, and Magellan led to an awareness of new plants, animals, minerals, medicines, peoples, languages, and ideas. These factors all contributed to a cultural environment in which people were open to new ways of looking at the world. The stage was set for the scientific revolution. In this chapter, we have seen Europe's discovery of Aristotle's this worldly philosophy and its necessity for the Renaissance. In one respect, the Renaissance was a complete accident. Aquinas certainly did not see it coming. If he could have seen the full consequences of his embrace of Aristotle, if he could have seen the full worldliness of the Renaissance and the resulting scientific and industrial revolutions, he would probably have burned his own books. The conflict over Aristotle during the 13th century can be seen as a conflict between the two metaphysical outlooks described in Chapter 4. As Aristotle entered Christian culture, people were turning away from the primacy of consciousness and toward the primacy of existence. The 1277 condemnation of 219 articles contains one, number 150, that embodies the central conflict. This article condemns the idea, quote, that on any question a man ought not to be satisfied with certitude based on authority, unquote. This article embodies the central conflict of the time. Should we accept ideas on the basis of faith in religious authorities? Or should we do our own reasoning based on our own observations to come to our own conclusions? Article 150 advocates accepting the ideas of religious authorities without question. This placement of a mind, the authority, over reality, one's own observations and reasoning, is a clear form of the primacy of consciousness.